Okay. So, 1 second. Well, okay. Forrest Howe is not with us yet this morning because the electricity is off in his area. He lives in Calamasa, and he says it's off in a wide area. We're not that far from him. So who knows? Maybe the electricity will go off here. If it does, just continue without us. Well, welcome, Gary. Welcome back to Sabbath School. This is your second Sabbath School this morning, the second one you're teaching, and we're looking at your chapter on learning. And I wonder if you have something you want to say about it before I begin some questions, or what is your pleasure?
Let's just dive into the conversation.
Okay, so I would like to begin this chapter's discussion with some general questions about you and then move to the chapter. One of the general questions I have is, what theme, if any, threads its way through all of your different books? If one looks at the different books, the various books, I should say, one sees quite a variety of different books, all the way from a book on Adventist thought to books on libertarian philosophy, anarchy, and things like that. Is there something that holds them together, or do you have a number of somewhat different interests, but equally important?
You know, I think it's a great question and a challenging one. I think that a lot of my books reflect my desire for flourishing interpersonal relationships. And, you know, and so I'm interested in thinking about those relationships directly, as for instance, with my dissertation on friendship that Dave's comments helped to improve so much, and which is finally coming out in print in a few months, but also about the institutional context in which peaceful, voluntary cooperation can happen among people, and in which relationships can develop and thrive and flourish. I don't think that's the only concern that I have, but of course, you know, my little venture into systematic theology, the analogy of love, certainly takes our experience of interpersonal love and asks what, you know, might happen if we treated that as a window on God's relationship with the world, as well as a central feature of our own spiritual and congregational lives. So that's not the only theme by any means. I mean, I'm interested in lots of stuff, and I continue to explore lots of stuff from a variety of angles. But I do think that concern for flourishing relationships is something that's quite important.
Okay, thank you. Here's another very general question, a little closer to the chapter, I think, and that is, what's the difference in your view between a college and a university? Why don't we say the idea of an Adventist college?
So, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, of course, if we did want to talk that way. And when I first envisioned this book, 30 plus years ago, that's probably the title I would have employed. As I suggest in the introduction, I don't think that the boundaries between the concept college and the concept university are at all precise, and I certainly think that people on both sides of that divide, institutions on both sides of that divide, ought to learn something from what I have to say here. We also recognize, to further complicate things, that there are comprehensive universities that really are more teaching institutions and therefore colleges, and there are research colleges that function much more like research universities. So it's a choice of focus that I guess I make here for four reasons. Not because I think you couldn't proceed in another direction, but so I think universities care about research, and I do think that's part of what I want to emphasize here as part of the truth-seeking mission of the higher educational institution. The term university reminds us that an institution is meaningfully involved in post-baccalaureate education. And I certainly don't want to forget about the importance of that here. And we might think about a university in the modern sense, they say the post-World War II sense in the United States, as quite self-consciously interested in impacting its communities, both through the work of its scholars and teachers and through the behavior of its students and alums. And I think it's also worth emphasizing the way in which the university label highlights the institution's task as a contributor to helping societies innovate. And so in none of these ways do I think there's a hard and fast distinction to be made, but I guess I use the term university with the thought that colleges do things that I'm talking about in this book, and so their activities aren't going to be ignored or disregarded. And of course, a typical Adventist higher educational institution is going to be small enough that it's going to probably operate undergraduate programs that feel pretty collegiate. On the other hand, if I'd called the book The Idea of an Adventist College, the various other things that universities do might have been seen to be sidelined.
Okay. It's interesting, I think, that in some countries, say in Australia, and I think in Canada, the word college is often used for secondary school.
And in English
so,
as well,
Is that right? So when we have a college in the sense that we mean it, that people will call it university college in order to distinguish the two. Now, it turns out that Avondale University has become a university and is one of the very few private universities in Australia. There are very few of them. And so congratulations to them.
Amen.
Now, I'd like to work through the chapter backwards, if that's okay. And one of the things you say near the end is that if something is worth doing, it's worth doing poorly or not. I'm not sure you want to say that much. If something is worth doing, it's worth doing even if one doesn't do it the very best. And I think you're talking about the student or any other person, but you're also talking about the institution as a whole.
Well, I'm especially interested, I think, in in the activities of students and faculty members. So it's what I want to suggest is that it's very important to avoid the temptation to be obsessive. It's very important to recognize that people have many different priorities, many different concerns, and so it was the reference that Dave highlights is from G.K. Chesterton, who said, "If a thing is worth doing, it is worth doing badly." And what Chesterton, I think, means is that some things are valuable for their own sake, and they remain valuable for their own sake, when done in a variety of ways. I think that if we look at higher education, so here's one example of the sort of thing I guess I'm concerned about. I value scholarship, I value research and publication. Those happen to be areas in which I think, I have strengths, and I tend to focus my energy there because I think it makes sense to do things that we can do with capacity and with enthusiasm. But I also recognize that other people have other priorities, that other people may be, for instance, vastly better teachers than I am. And it seems to me that it's important to have an institutional culture that makes room for the variety of gifts that people have, that doesn't expect everybody to fit the same profile of performance, either institutionally or individually. And that as individuals, we also recognize that we want, when we look at our performance, I think in any given context, we certainly want to be, as the why am I blanking on this? The child psychologist, David Winnicott, I think, who talked about good enough parenting and offered this as a way to emphasize that, people sometimes obsess about being, about sort of maximizing their parenting performance. And what we need, Winnicott suggested, is good enough parenting. And I think that notion of good enough matters in a lot of different contexts. We don't want to, we don't want to fumble things. We don't want to mess them up, but we want to be aware of what we're good at. We want to focus there, I think, in an institutional context. And we want to recognize that we can do, we can engage in performance that's good enough without being obsessive. There are people who turn out to invest everything in one small, narrow facet of life and may do extraordinarily well there. And they may be thoroughly admired by others. And yet it may be that for many of the rest of us, the losses that people with that kind of obsessive focus undergo wouldn't be ones we'd want to suffer. So the point is not to tell other people how to select their priorities, but to say that as institutions that care about quality, we should also care about not encouraging a culture in which people are overwhelmed. Dave, your mic's off, Dave.
I think that's helpful, and it's sort of pertinent in an almost painful way. I can recall sitting in a curriculum development committee for one of the programs, and as I looked at it, it seemed very full to me, and I said to the group, I'm not sure how a person could live a balanced life if taking this course. I don't mean a particular course, but this course of study leading to a particular degree. And there was a little surprise that I said that, and then someone said, well, anyone who wants to be at the top of this discipline is not going to have a balanced life. Just put it right out there. And I was a little startled by that. If you want to have a well-rounded life, don't go into this specialty. That was the response, and nobody on the committee objected. And I felt a little sheepish for having even brought the issue up. But it does seem to me what you've said would be a caution against that kind of thinking. Why not? It seems to me most of the time, these programs could be stretched out over a longer period of time without causing so much family and domestic stress. You want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you were a voice for, as it seems to me, sanity in that context. So I want to emphasize again, I am not at all opposed to, and indeed I am a fan of, the eccentric, right? That is, I recognize that there are going to be people who really, really care about nothing as much as they care about vertebrate paleontology. And that's awesome. And my goal is not to say in what I write in this chapter, if that's your passion, please ignore it and adopt the kind of life I would choose to adopt. What I am trying to suggest, though, is if you think you have to do that because somehow the only way to have a good life is to have a life that is driven in that way, then I want you to take a second look at that.
Okay. I was not a voice for sanity. I was so surprised I didn't have anything to say. Well, okay, now I'd like to read a few lines from further backward in your chapter, because I think they're very provocative. So I'll read the last line or two of one paragraph, then the first line or two of the second, then drop down a little bit more in the second. You say, Admitting someone because of hardships overcome, family connections, or other characteristics not plausibly related to anticipated excellence in performance seems like a missed opportunity. And I gather that means if that person's admitted to the program, we have missed an opportunity to admit somebody else. But you go on in the next paragraph to say, it may sometimes be reasonable to choose a less qualified applicant to a large undergraduate program over one more qualified because the less qualified is an athlete or a legacy, that is, a relative of an alum, with the expectation that the decision to do so will, over time, result in significant donations or other benefits to the university. Drop, drop, drop. No one is personally entitled to be admitted to a university, so no one is wrong when, for instance, a legacy or an athlete is chosen over someone more capable. So you could have, to put it in extreme sense, you could have somebody who was academically at the very, very, very top, and that person would be excluded on behalf of someone who is a C minus or D plus student, but is a fantastic basketball player or football player or something like that. Somehow that doesn't seem just quite right to me. What do you think?
Well, so I don't think it's not going to be the person at the very top who's excluded. That person's always going to be admitted. It's going to be the person right on the edge at the bottom who misses out because of the admission of the person with lower qualifications. So again, the question here is, what are you trying to accomplish with an undergrad program? What are you trying to accomplish with a graduate program? So the paragraphs that you read from, the first one is about a medical school. I offer that as an example. And I suggest that in a medical school, we need to be committed to, it seems to me, recruiting the strongest possible class because, we as patients and our loved ones as patients would prefer to be cared for by the most capable people. Now, I suggest that how you measure capacity can include a variety of factors. I don't take the position that somehow only one single measure, say, of academic excellence is the right measure of capacity as a physician. But the point is, the most important thing we probably want to do when admitting somebody to the practice of medicine is thinking, or to the study of medicine, en route to the practice of medicine, is to think about whether that person's going to be able to provide great care. And because if I then go on as a patient and get less than standard care, less than high quality care, when I could have had you made another decision, I think I might reasonably resent that. An undergrad program, a big capacious undergrad program, it seems to me, can afford to be a lot more loosey-goosey about things. We admit people for all kinds of reasons to undergrad programs, and the important thing to remember is when we think about institutional mission, right? The institutional mission is to do a variety of things which may be furthered by admission choices in various ways. We will further the institutional mission by admitting great students who will go on to do great work. We'll also further admission choices, further institutional mission rather, by admitting people who will enrich the class in various ways, with their presence. And we will further institutional mission by admitting people whose presence will promote the overall effectiveness of the institution. Again, I suggest as athletes or legacies as examples. So the point is, if I'm going to be able, let's say, over the long term to offer, 10 scholarships a year to, financially challenged but academically brilliant students, because I admit a clunker this year and later get a donation from that person, it seems to me that's a perfectly reasonable calculation I might make with respect to institutional mission. You turn on your mic, Dave.
quite a utilitarian one might suggest. Trading off one clunker for 10 academically superior people.
Yeah, but how do you decide who's the clunker and who's not?
There you
Oh,
go,
well,
Bob.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sure. So, I mean, look, institutions are going to have different ways of making that judgment. My own view is the way you do it, if you're serious, is that you clearly identify, various kinds of outcomes, and you determine what characteristics of some applicant predict those outcomes. I mean, it seems to me you're able to do that. And if you say, look, these 10 folks are going to perform well both academically and later professionally. I think there are ways you can predict that. You can't predict it perfectly. The bigger your admission pool, I think the better you're able to do that, probably.
I'd like to linger here a little bit longer. Bob, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I had the question about the medical school is intriguing because I remember, and I'm sure you, Dave, have dealt with these admission issues among physicians. What about the student that will be a great family physician, but he's not a scientific genius, he's not a medical genius, he'll be a great family doctor, but then isn't often when we admit physicians or people into medical school these days, we look at academic excellence, but they're not necessarily good people. I mean, they may become a Nobel laureate in medicine, but you don't want them at your bedside with your mother.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I say here on pages 60 and 61, excellence. Excellence in this case, in the case of a physician, doesn't just mean the ability to diagnose, to prescribe, or perform surgery, though these abilities are obviously very important. It also includes the ability to understand a patient's situation, to respond sensitively, to communicate graciously and gently. And of course, there's no one unified measure of excellence, no basis for claiming that there's a perfect balance among, say, intellectual, interpersonal, and physical skills. So what I'm interested in is however the institution defines excellent performance as a physician, that's what it ought to be interested in. I'm not suggesting that I have, some definition of what that standard of excellence should be. I'm just suggesting that the institute, when taking a factor into account in admission, it seems to me the institution should ask, is this factor a predictor of excellent performance as a physician, however that excellent performance is defined?
Okay, I'd like to linger a little bit longer here and talk about making selections on the basis of race or gender or economic class or anything of that sort. Should admissions committees take into account a person's race or ethnicity or nationality or gender?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that's a function of institutional mission, right? And the question for the institution is going to be, if we take these factors into account, how will this affect our ability to achieve our mission? And so you might imagine an institution, for instance, that has a mission to impact a particular marginal community, and might say, therefore, we're going to use our institutional tuition support dollars and so forth to attract students we are confident are going to invest in some particular marginal community. I think that would be a perfectly reasonable institutional choice. What I want to emphasize is that if the institution chooses to emphasize these demographic characteristics, it needs to have a clear sense of how doing so will fit into the achievement of institutional mission. So it might be to serve, as I say, this is some underserved community. It might be with the perception that the admission of a particular student will enrich the experience of everybody else on the campus. It's important to start with a conception of what the institution's mission is that isn't pegged to these particular admission decisions, and then ask how the admission decisions will demonstrably, facilitate the achievement of the mission. And so I don't think I have some a priori judgment about whether that'll be true in a particular case. I think what matters is that the question be asked and answered with respect to mission.
Well, over the years, the classes I was involved in shifted from being almost entirely populated by men to about 50-50 now. And I don't think that's because there are fewer men who are qualified, but I think it's because people made some conscious decision to have a more gender balanced class. So I get your point. On the other hand, it's a difficult one. One more on this issue, though, on admissions. What about religion? I think it's true to say that in some Adventist professional schools, it would be possible to have a higher standard of entrance qualifications if one did not take into account religion. And there are some people who are more qualified than someone who is an Adventist applicant, and therefore that is taken into account. Now, I have wondered how long that can happen when an institution is taking a lot of money from the federal government and other forms of government to support its research and other things. Will the day not come when the taxpayer says, well, if you're taking the taxpayers' money to help run your institution, we don't want your institution to be so religiously selective? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, it seems to me that, look, there are always complications associated with the receipt of government grants. I think it's clear that right now there's a pretty general consensus that religious institutions, religiously oriented educational institutions, can select students and faculty members on the basis of religious identity without suffering penalties. But perhaps you're right that at some point somebody might seriously question this. One thing I think it would be important to remember, if there were questions raised about this, is that there's very little reason to believe that as a society we benefit when everything's the same. I think there's real value in having different ecological niches that develop in different ways and explore things from different perspectives. And, institutions can engage, in what John Stuart Mill famously called experiments in living. And one kind of experiment in living, I think, is experimenting with the connection between religious identity on the one hand and professional performance on the other. So as I suggested earlier, thinking specifically about medical school, so one sort of professional school at least, what we want to ask is what would make for overall excellence in a way that we'd be comfortable with if we were being treated or our loved ones were being treated. And so an institution, I'm not arguing one way or the other about what the institution should do, but it seems to me an institution could make the case that the religious values of professionals, let's say in this case physicians, might really matter for the overall quality of patient care. And so remember, again, that's, I think, the primary reason, it seems to me, for selecting people. And so when you say, we might pick stronger applicants if we didn't care about religion, I mean, maybe the institution would say, well, but in our overall calculus, part of the strength that we're interested in is precisely the strength that we believe people will bring to the table because of their spiritual lives. So we might push back at that. I think this, we can argue about that, but it seems to me you might think that that was distinctively valuable and worth taking into account. I'm not yeah, I'm not prepared to be dogmatic about that one way or the other, but I think we shouldn't just dismiss that possibility.
Well,
David,
it's complicated because sometimes people who are not members of the Adventist community who apply to a professional school are not only academically superior, but they are what we would call spiritually superior. They are more invested in genuine Christianity than some people who were baptized into the Adventist church when they were 11 years old and haven't really given it much thought, much less much commitment. Now, my own experience is that people who come to us from other faith communities can be a blessing, but they can also be a difficulty because sometimes they bring to the class very fundamentalistic ideas and are not pleased when they don't get that kind of Christianity here, and that sometimes causes conflict and discord and so forth. So for me, inviting or accepting people who are highly qualified and religiously intense people from other communities of faith is I think should be done, but it's also a tricky one, tricky problem.
David, could I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Brian Bull, 20 years ago, as I remember, actually did some research on Loma Linda School of Medical admissions as well as their performance. Brian, could you maybe comment on the research that you did on this very topic for Loma Linda?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so, but it'll take a little bit of time, and I think it would be better if I waited until Gary has gone through what it is he wishes to say, and David has. But yes, I can deal with Loma Linda's viewpoint because I served as dean of the medical school for 10 years and worried a great deal about these things. So, but I don't think this would be the appropriate time. It'll derail the process right now.
But I'm with Dick. I'd love to hear what Brian has to say. I think that would be fascinating.
Yes, if there's any chance Brian won't be here for the discussion, I think we should put him on right now. What do you think, Brian?
Okay.
Brian, get a thumbs up.
All right. I agree with everything that's been said, but the problem that Loma Linda experiences is not quite what it's not it's specific, I think, to Loma Linda for the following reasons. Our class size is large enough that it's possible for us to accept all Adventist students and still all qualified Adventist students. And you're going to ask me how we determine qualified. All qualified Adventist students, and then turn to students of other faiths who apply and still take a significant number of them. In a typical class, it's going to be about 1 out of every 3 students is not going to be an Adventist. Now, how do we determine qualified Adventists? Well, that one is fairly straightforward because doctors have to pass board examinations. And so the research that Dick Osborne's referring to was a mathematical algorithm. It was actually a sequence of 4 mathematical algorithms that we utilized to predict what the students were going to score on their first board exam. If a student cannot pass a board exam, despite being otherwise qualified for medicine, they're not going to ever be able to practice because none of the states will allow them to do so. So we came up with a series of mathematical algorithms that couldn't predict very well for any given student, but for a group of students that achieved a certain level, we could tell the admissions committee that for every 3 or 4 students you accept below this level, you're going to have at least 1 failure. Now the accrediting agencies come into play because they will allow medical school, once we accept a student, to continue operation as long as no more than about 6% of students fail to complete the medical program. So philosophy meets some very hard-edged obstacles here. But at Loma Linda, we're fortunate enough, or I suppose we could be more fortunate to be blessed with more Adventist, qualified Adventist applicants. But we take all of the qualified applicants that we think stand a reasonable chance of passing the boards. And then we turn our attention to non-Adventist applicants. And for that reason, we're picking from the top of the applicant pool for non-Adventist applicants. And that's why many of them perform exceptionally well and contribute to a major degree in the makeup of the class and amongst the accomplishments of our alumni.
Oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something more?
No.
Okay. About how many applicants do you get and how many do you accept?
We get about 5,000 applicants. We accept for interview about 350 to 400. And our present class size, the last I checked, was about 160.
Wow, from 5,000 to 350, half of that, then 160. That's amazing. Dick, did you want to say anything about this?
Well, I just remember, Brian, the point was that some of those, if you were just going to take the top students, a lot of Adventist students wouldn't get accepted, but that the ones that you were able to outperform the predictions for a class because of what you do at Loma Linda, and that the risk that you were taking on some students as compared to those students, as you said, from out of the church with high MCAT scores, beyond perhaps what some of those are that you accept, still you produce a good result. That's kind of the bottom line I remember from that research.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I did some calculations on the average performance of medical students in their undergraduate academic achievements. And based on that and the MCAT scores, we were at the time taking a class at about the 35th percentile nationwide. And 2 years later, because of, I would think, Loma Linda's religious background and its faculty, the class performed at about the 55th percentile in the first of national boards, part one, which, by the way, is no longer going to be given due to philosophical considerations of the sort that Gary and David have been discussing. The having to pass an examination of that sort is now considered to be questionable pedagogy, and I'm not quite sure. I personally thought it was a good idea, but obviously I'm out of date with present educational theory. But yes, we would take a class at 35th percentile, and they would perform after 2 years at Loma Linda at the 50 to 55th percentile on first part of national boards.
Well, that's very remarkable. I sometimes annoyed Roy Branson because I would say, Harvard's not doing that much. It admits the best students and it graduates the best students. What really counts is taking people who might not be the very best and in a couple of years leverage them up to the point where they're contributing as much as people from elsewhere. I think that's a more commendable achievement, but he did not particularly like that. So I have to say, as a patient, I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea that this exam will no longer be given. What is the justification for that?
Well, the justification is that ranking students in order of competence is no longer appropriate.
Gary, Gary, I can see that you're wanting to comment on that. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I think that's just absurd. I mean, I think, again, as I suggest in the book and in what I've said before, I think an institution needs to make judgments about, the weighting of various factors that it wants to take into account with respect to its mission, and it needs to base admission decisions and so forth on mission. But the notion that academic strength wouldn't be very highly correlated with professional performance, on the face of it, seems really questionable. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm deeply disappointed, and I think I agree with Dave that as a patient, I'd like to know, and this was my point earlier, that anybody who is selected for and certainly graduated from a medical school should be selected and evaluated on the basis of that person's likely performance as a physician. And it strikes me as wildly unlikely that academic performance would, as a general matter, not be a good predictor of that.
Let's hang on here. Dick, do you want to say anything more?
No, just to comment that I think many of you know that many very elite universities are getting rid of ACT and SAT requirements because they feel that they harm some students from certain backgrounds. And that means that the actual number of applications at some of these elite universities has gone way up, because students who know they may have excellent grades, they may have excellent records at the high school where they are, may just not perform very well on an ACT or SAT exam, which may not be a great predictor of how they're going to do in college. And so there's a lot greater diversity in the admissions of some of these elite universities than they had before, because they're getting a greater applicant pool and students that have performed very well at the high school level.
Are they providing some kind of measure in addition to these tests that would be an adequate substitute?
Well, we'll find out because some of these have just eliminated them this year. The question of whether there's a reliability between test scores on the ACT and SAT and actual performance. So it'll be a great experiment to see what happens, but it will result in a greater diversity in the freshman classes of many of these elite universities next year.
And it seems to me the worry that I'd have there, I guess that two kinds of things. Unavoidably, institutions are going to recognize that secondary school programs differ dramatically in quality, and so you can't simply look at a grade from a secondary institution and judge that it's cross comparable with all the other grades from other secondary institutions, and it's going to be very unclear how to proceed. And realistically, I think what's going to happen is that prior knowledge about the quality of the secondary school is going to then end up serving as a proxy there often. And what that means, therefore, is that a highly capable student from a not great school who could, however, deliver great test performance and demonstrate ability that was outstanding will probably end up being disadvantaged in that kind of situation. So I think there's that problem. The other problem I worry about here is that once students are admitted, we're not really going to be able to tell whether the other mechanisms used to predict performance are successful, because performance measurement is going to change. That is to say, institutions are going to be under pressure to upgrade how how students are evaluated. As we know, especially at elite institutions, grade inflation has been increasing dramatically, and so the result's going to be that's going to continue. We're not really going to be able to tell how students are doing, because if nobody gets less than a B plus, we're really going to have no way of being certain that we've predicted performance adequately or not, because the grades themselves won't adequately distinguish among different performance levels.
Okay, shall we move on to the next?
Laura has a question.
Oh, Laura, okay, I didn't see it. Go ahead, Laura. No?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was mute. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to make a comment that we just went through this process in our family. It was a very difficult year. We had a senior in high school, and he was applying, of course, to the colleges that have now gone test optional. But I would just make the comment that he was going to a very good private high school, and what they chose to do, most of the students, was that until colleges say you may not turn in an ACT or an SAT result, the students who can get those good scores are going to turn them in, because of course those measurements still provide some kind of benchmark for the universities that they cannot have otherwise. There's no other way to winnow through those huge, vast numbers of applicants that they're getting from schools all over the country. And until they absolutely will not accept an ACT or an SAT exam, they still are very valuable. They still tell them what they need to know. And he had a very successful experience with his college application process, because it was difficult to take the ACT last year and the SAT. It was extremely challenging, and many kids were not able to take it, but he was able to take it one time and get a good enough score. And we were thankful that he went through that process. But it is like the Wild West out there right now, with getting into college and what is really happening with the admissions process. I just wanted to make that comment. And I was also going to say that I actually sat on the dental school admissions committee for a number of years, and would echo that we did basically the same thing that Dr. Bull was describing. We went through all of the SDA applicants in order from highest ranking to lowest ranking, and then we went to the highest ranking applicants that were not SDA. And it sometimes produces some unintended consequences, but there was no other way to do it. That was all. Thanks.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Although I must say I have a little worry if people in the know can submit their ACT and SAT scores, and they are taken into account, and then maybe people who don't know that they can send them in are at a disadvantage. Seems to me the university should say you don't have to, and maybe this is what they say. You don't have to, but if you do, we'll take them into account. Do they say that?
That's what they say right now. And some of them won't, some say they won't look at it. It's very case by case. It's very individual. I mean, the UC system has their what they've said, and they say they're going to develop their own test, but that's the UC system. And then there's the rest of the East Coast that we were looking at mostly.
Okay. Well, okay, this hops over just a little bit the sequence of questions I had in mind, but since we're here, let's talk about grades and how valuable or not valuable they are. Let's see if I can find the section in which Gary discusses grades. One little bit here. Maybe you know what page it is, Gary.
Well, I can look here. Give me a second.
I'm looking.
Let's see.
Okay.
It starts on page 77.
77.
No, sorry, 76. Oh, you know what, Dave?
The paging is different, so I'm
No.
still.
Yes, the number on the page is 54. I'm really sorry.
Okay, that's right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Now you say that these grades should be based on competence only. Things such as honesty, friendliness, moral virtue, hard work, diligence, punctuality, a willingness to complete busy work. All of those things should not be taken into account, but that is not be taken into account when grading is occurring. I think they are taken into account when other factors than grades are being considered. But you say it is fundamentally different from information about a student's academic capacities, and combining these kinds of information seems likely to lead to misunderstanding. What would you like to say about that?
Yeah, so what I want to suggest is that the primary function of a grade is to convey information about student competence to various publics. So at the undergraduate level, for instance, two kinds of groups will be the most important consumers of transcript information: graduate schools and employers. And so the point, it seems to me, is that you want to deliver grades that are going to be as useful as possible to those graduate schools and employers, so that, for instance, when, as Dr. Bull suggests, an admissions committee is examining the question, how is this person likely to perform, we'll be able to look at the undergraduate academic performance of a student. The student applies to a graduate school, and we ask, well, how do people with this kind of academic performance from this academic institution function at our institution? And that's going to be easiest to predict if there's a fairly narrow range of information types encapsulated in those grades. And so similarly, employers want to know about student capacities, as those are predictors of job performance. So I just think that what we want to make sure is that we have grading mechanisms, grading strategies, whatever you want to call them, that make it the case that consumers of transcript information can make good use of the information that's provided.
Okay, someone who's watching this may be saying, what does this have to do with Sabbath school? This is a Sabbath school, and we're discussing admissions criteria and so forth and so on. I have an answer that satisfies me on that. Do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, I guess the answer, sure, absolutely. I think that this is not just, a question about mechanics. It's a question about ethics. It's a question about what it is for an institution to, embrace a mission of service to its various publics, and how its grading processes can help it to fulfill that mission, and also just how they can, on an ongoing basis, be expressions of a kind of a basic virtue of non-deception on the part of people who are communicating through the assignment of grades with transcript consumers. So I think this is ethically important, and I mean, I've been arguing that since I first wrote an article about this 15 years ago.
Oh, I agree with you wholly. Okay, it's 11:32 our time here. Let's take a break, and then we will resume. Let's say 10 minutes from now would be 11:42. Let's say 11:45. Okay, that'll give us about 13 minutes for a break. Thank you, Gary, and we will continue upon our return.
Say, Gary, can I ask a question here in the interim?
Yeah, sure.
I happened yesterday to be looking at a small college up in the Northwest. Maybe you know about it. It's called Goddard College. Do you know this place?
I've heard of it. I'm not sure that I know anything about it, but I've certainly heard of it.
And they pride themselves on creating a very experiential type of environment where they don't look at grades at all, but they look at how people get along with each other. They look at their contributions to the community. They look at their development in personality and critical thinking, and their ability to be activists on various kinds of issues. And so now, this is not a Christian institution, it's a secular institution. But when you come back, could you talk about maybe how an Adventist institution might what should be the main missions of an Adventist institution in terms of its impact on the community? And are grades really the best way of determining whether that student is going to become a good Adventist leader of some kind? Now, and you may want to discuss this later, but I was just fascinated by this particular college because they've taken a very kind of a extreme view toward going against normal grading and things of that nature. Yeah.
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that when we come back.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Osborne, are you there?
Am.
Are you there? Can I ask a question of you while we wait to resume the...
Sure.
So my observation so far is that the discussion seemed to be oriented towards an Adventist university with a medical mission or emphasis. I wonder if you could comment on how the admissions considerations relate to an Adventist university with an engineering emphasis. The reason for the question is most students who enter engineering school, either at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, don't typically do so with the intent of obtaining the professional engineering credential or license. So how might an Adventist institution, helping students work through that process, qualify them for admission?
I think that most of them are just urging them to go to Walla Walla. So, I think there's some pre-engineering programs, maybe a couple of years, and then students transfer because Walla Walla is the only one that's offering an engineering program, which highlights a problem, and that is that the support systems for young people that are not in Adventist schools need to be improved and increased, because all students aren't going to go to Walla Walla to get their engineering program. So it's to their advantage to either start at an undergraduate institution. University of Maryland is where I went for my graduate work, and they have great engineering programs. So should a student just go ahead and start there, or should they take a couple of years at an Adventist institution and then transfer in? Seems like if there were better support systems, the question would be, go to the best place you can get an engineering degree and hope that there's a local church and family that can give you a good support system. Am I ducking your question?
No, I think you kind of answered it in a way, but the reason for that, begin my inquiry, is that even past the engineering degree, if a student wanted to become a licensed professional, even if they had the PhD, they would still need to get on a track that gets them ready for that professional engineering testing program, which starts with taking the engineering training exam during your undergraduate preparation. And then after that, working for 6 or more years under similarly licensed engineers who can then recommend you to sit for that exam. And I think one of the reasons for the stringency of that whole exercise is that licensing process confers upon the licensee what the states call responsible charge authority, which comes with a seal and a stamp. So
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that gets back to my point of, in the Adventist church, it's been Walla Walla, where that's supposed to be able to happen. And I don't know what the success record is of their graduates from the undergraduate level going on for graduate degrees and doctoral levels and all the process that you've outlined. The other choice is get into the very best university you can and start the process there and try to create a good support system for those students beyond being in an Adventist institution. Family, local church, peer individuals of their same age that they can be with, and put a focus there as well. I think too often we put the focus on being in an Adventist university as compared to creating support systems for a student wherever they are. And so I'm kind of in favor of broadening the definition of Christian education beyond the formal Adventist education to the total support system that's involved in enabling a young person to still stay committed to the Adventist church, but do that in whatever setting they are in. And in the case of an engineering student, that might mean going to a UC campus or another campus with strong programs, and then creating those support systems.
And then one last thing for those.
Welcome back, everybody. We've had a good break, and we're ready to begin again. Now, we have rules And when they're broken, people have to pay a penalty. One of our rules is that we don't discuss things of substance during the break because that leaves other people out. So the penalty is that one has to re-ask the question, and then we have to have the answer again so that everybody gets involved. And I think, Bob Ford, you were the first one who had a question during the break. How about repeating it?
I'll see if I can remember exactly.
It was about a college up in the Northwest somewhere.
Right, yeah, and I did put a link. There's a college, it's called Goddard College, and I was happening to look at it because I'm interested in potentially eventually moving to some college town, just as up in the Northwest. And I was intrigued because it classes itself as being unique in not using grades at all. I posted a link on the chat that looks at their philosophy of education. I think it's really quite interesting. And it talks about creating, what shall we say here? It says progressive education for creative minds. And it talks about a very unique approach to education that's experiential, person to person, a lot of activism involved with the community, all kinds of things that sounds like Adventist education in many respects, but it's a secular place. So I was asking Gary if he would talk about maybe, is Adventist education that much different, or what is unique about an Adventist philosophy of education that we should be, he's trying to get us to look at? Or is it similar to what this place might be trying to do, but then we add an Adventist element to it? And that's kind of where I left it.
Okay, Gary.
Well, so look, obviously a lot of things to say there. You know, I don't know a whole lot about Goddard, so I don't want to pretend to be able to comment authoritatively. But I think that Goddard, as it's described in the material that Bob linked to, look, is interesting and appealing as regards its focus on creativity and on individual kind of uniqueness and one-on-one encounters, it seems to me. And at that level, I'd say this could be a really stimulating educational experience for people. I don't have the view at all, and nothing in this book is intended to suggest otherwise. I don't have the view at all that there's a one-size-fits-all model for Adventist education. And I don't think there would be anything undesirable about an Adventist institution seeking to develop a model that's something like the one that Goddard employs. Just a couple of observations there. I think that the fact that Goddard is not primarily focused on the campus experience means that there's a loss of the kind of acculturation that I think you can get in kind of intensive shared experience on campus, potentially. Again, no, it's not a reason not to do it. I'm just expressing a preference. As regards grades, because this is what it seems to me was on the table and may have initially prompted Bob's interest in our talking about Goddard. My view is not at all that somehow it's a requirement of academic goodness that an institution employ just the evaluative system that many U.S. institutions employ. We know, for instance, that European universities often evaluate quite differently based on end-of-the-year exams. So my claim is just that when you do evaluate accurately and focus on competence. don't lie and recognize the diversity of the different things we might be interested in and the difference between competence and other things. So if somebody said, I'd rather go to an institution that provides detailed narrative evaluations of students. And of course, this has been done at a variety of institutions. For instance, was done for a while, I think, at UC Santa Cruz. I think that's just fine. I don't think that needs to be in any way a violation of the sort of canons of grading integrity that I've tried to argue for briefly in this book and in a little more detail elsewhere. I would say, however, that while this kind of grading arrangement, this kind of evaluative arrangement, it's not a grading arrangement, of course, would be perfectly compatible with the desiderata that I've laid out, it does seem as if, practically speaking, it might deprive a lot of students of opportunities they might otherwise have, because in the nature of the case, when a student is a stranger to an employer or a graduate school and has to be compared with lots of other strangers, the kind of narrative evaluation that's offered here will be hard to use for that purpose. And there will be a lot of gambling involved on the part of institutions and employers, and that may be a problem in terms of the opportunities created for some students. So I think that's worth thinking about. Certainly not a reason to explore this and other possibilities. Your mic, Dave, your mic.
Thank you, Gary. Over to McKinley. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Gary, for doing that. McKinley, you had a question for Dick Osborne. Could you repeat that for us, please?
Sure, thank you, Dave. So I observed that the discussion seemed to be oriented towards Adventist universities with a medical mission or an emphasis. And I wondered if anyone, and Dr. Osborne happened to have a response, could comment on how the admission considerations relate to an Adventist institution with an engineering emphasis. And the reason for the inquiry is this: most students who enter engineering school, either at the undergrad or graduate level, don't typically do so with the intent of obtaining the professional engineering credential or license, which takes on an additional level of preparation and responsibility. How might the considerations Gary talked about today apply to an Adventist engineering university or an Adventist university with an engineering emphasis?
Okay, I think Dick is still here. Do you want to comment on that, Dick Osborne?
Well, I'd like to hear Gary's response, and then I might provide something after that.
Okay, Gary.
Sure. So there's a fairly brief treatment in the book, as you'll find when you check out the text, of medical schools and medical school admissions. This is not a book that's focused primarily on institutions with medical emphases, naturally, because we're having this conversation at an institution that does have that kind of emphasis. It's unsurprising that we might talk about that as we have. So the considerations, just as a general matter, that I tried to lay out here, about medicine are, I think, pretty straightforwardly applicable in the same way to engineering, right? That is, if we imagine that somebody's going to be, developing an integrated circuit that's going to be used to control my automobile, or building a bridge that I'm going to be driving over, I really want that person to be as capable as possible. I want good work to be done there. In fact, with respect to the applicant to an engineering program, realistically, I'm going to be even less concerned about non-academic factors than I might with respect to medical school admission, because as a general matter, we don't recruit engineers, and engineering performance isn't, reflective of, concern with bedside manner. And
I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, and so therefore, I think we want to be, concerned with excellent performance. And I think that's a matter of the golden rule. It's a matter of saying, by bringing in people who are going to do well, we are serving both their employers and also the consumers who benefit from the products that they design and develop. And of course, again, I think performance is never just one thing. There are lots of different factors involved in performance. And I'd love to think that, for instance, we would, if we operated an engineering program at an Adventist university, we'd certainly want to produce students who thought about big picture issues related to the impact of their work on the wider world, and we'd want people who had the integrity to be whistleblowers and so forth. But allowing for that, I think the same considerations are fundamentally applicable. Part of being fair, part of adhering to the golden rule with respect to all those who will be affected by the work of our graduates is precisely, I think, ensuring that the people who are we admit the people we think we're going to be able to graduate as the best possible performers of the group we get, allowing for the various things that go into making up strong performance. Dick, I'd love to hear what
Thank you, Gary. And McKinley, Dick, would you like to say something?
Well, we only have one engineering program in the church, and that's at Walla Walla. There are some undergraduate programs where they'll do 2 years and then they'll go on to Walla Walla, but that's the one program that exists there. And I don't know if they have waiting lists to get in and if they're making choices. I think Loma Linda is one of the only places that has waiting lists to get into various schools. There may be some other examples, maybe some nursing programs, but most are scrambling to get any student they can to balance the budget because they're largely student tuition driven. So it's not a matter of picking the best students that have come in. It's a matter of trying to get a class so that you can balance your budget. But let me just divert, which I was just saying when you came back on with McKinley, this idea that you have to go to an Adventist college or you're not going to keep your faith. I have argued for many years that we should broaden our definition of Christian education to not just be the formal Adventist K-12 school or college, but to be every chance the church has to influence the Christian life of a young person. It starts in the family, it continues in the church, it continues in the peer groups that support them, so that we are less concerned about, you've got to go to an Adventist school to get an engineering degree, and that's got to be Walla Walla because it's the only one that's there. No, if you choose to go to a UC campus, the church creates a support system beyond just that university experience that enables that person to have a lifelong commitment to Christianity, perhaps to Adventism. My bigger concern is to the Christian values than it is to a formal connection with the Adventist church, and just broaden our definition of Christian education to include a better support system for young people wherever they're going. That includes if they're even in an Adventist school. We don't always like great support systems. We think that once we've paid the tuition, they're going to take care of it for us. And so, Dave, it's basically arguing for a broader definition of Christian education with less worry about going to Walla Walla, in this case, for the engineering program, or in the case of Loma Linda, if the person didn't get into a particular school, what are we going to do to support them if they get into another school? And how do we surround them with Christian education with this broader definition?
Thank you, Dick. Do you have a quick memory about how many Adventist students are in Adventist colleges or universities and how many are not? Are there any numbers on that?
I don't know about the not, because those, have just been touted around, whether there's any actual research. You hear figures like 70% that are not. And I have the numbers for enrollment here, but they're not off the top of my head right now. It's not a large number when you look at the overall system. It's perhaps the size of a UC campus, if even that.
Okay, but approximately 70% of young Adventists are not going to Adventist schools. Is that correct?
No, that I don't know. You hear stuff thrown around, but it's a lot.
Okay, all right. And your point is that we're not doing enough for them, or not doing as much as we could for them. That's a very important point. Okay, I have other questions, but does someone else have one first?
Laura looks like she does.
Laura?
Hi, sorry, I have a question again. Well, a comment again. I appreciate Dr. Osborne's comments. I've listened to him talking recently in several different forums on Adventist Voices, and appreciated his words there too. And I have children who are 19 and 21, and I'm sorry to say that I'm just going to be very frank that it's too late for my children. The changes that need to occur in the Adventist Church. I still see them, and when I taught Sabbath school since my children were very little, and I used to teach, every week, and I would look at the children that were in the room with me, and I would then look at who went to the Adventist school. Now I'm talking about elementary school, and I know you're talking about university, but it's not unlinked, and it was such a small number of children that were attending the Adventist school. Many were homeschooled, but many were just attending other school systems. And I just have seen in my entire adult life this desperate need that this church has to reach out to the children in the church and do something to bring them in, because school is no longer the way that it's happening. It was in my generation, it was in my parents' generation largely, but it isn't for my children. It hasn't been for my children. And so I love what Dr. Osborne is saying about how you should go to the school that is best for you. And I agree with that, but I'm not sure that the church is prepared with the programs or the support for young people and children who don't fit that old-fashioned traditional way that was the way it was for, it wasn't forever, but it was for a good long time, from as long as most of us can remember.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman. Gary, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So first of all, just note that I have dropped into the chat now the PDF of the book. So anybody who's actually in the conversation right now should be able to download the PDF from the chat. So I just want to make this as accessible to people as possible. So I think that the observations, the different observations that Laura and Dick have made highlight the importance from the standpoint of the church of thinking about ways of inspiring, connecting with Adventist students, helping them to integrate their academic and religious convictions in ways that don't necessarily involve involvement in the life of a formal Adventist educational institution. And that's, I think it's only wise to be thinking about those possibilities and exploring ways of offering students spiritual and intellectual nurture and social connection, outside the structure of formal educational institutions. Clearly, for years, people have talked about the Mormon model here, where you have how the LDS House of Religion that might sit next door, as it does to UC Riverside, and Mormon students can connect there, even as they're also at the same time enrolled at UCR. So I think we certainly need to be aware of those possibilities and aware of the different ways in which the church can be involved in nourishing people. And indeed, it may be that one mission of specifically Adventist educational institutions sometimes might be providing that sort of nourishment. So I'm not at all interested in sidelining that or dismissing it. It's just not what I'm writing about. I'm interested first and foremost in what might happen on the campus of an institution that sees itself as educating full-time students at the undergraduate and graduate levels, and engaging in research and so forth. I'm not at all inclined to think that we don't have a lot to learn from these other models that Dick and Laura have prompted us to think about.
Okay, thank you very much. Someone else?
Great.
All right, go ahead. What were you going to say, Gary?
Oh no, I just I bet you had some other questions. I was just
Sure, but I don't want to cut off anybody who might want to ask a question or make a comment now.
Dave McKinley here. After your question, I want to ask another question linking what Gary said and Dr. Bull's earlier work at Loma University. But
why don't you go ahead to keep the conceptual continuity as tight as we can?
Okay, so trying to link three things. Dave's consideration of other factors as for admission purposes. Dr. Bull's research and work on identifying or predicting the likelihood of students admitted to the medical program who could go on to pass the board, in Gary's work. I wonder what an Adventist university would look like that has an engineering curriculum that focuses on churning out students who went on to become professional engineers, since that is a very winnowing type of a process. Would there be a way of predicting the likelihood of students who enrolled into that engineering program or were accepted at the admissions level to be successful in pursuing the professional engineering credential?
Well, so obviously there are different ways in which that's going to look in different societies and different cultural contexts, and also, of course, with different engineering specialties. But to the so your focus on professional licensure, it seems to me, is a quite straightforward focus for prediction, right? If indeed that's what you're interested in, then you can quite straightforwardly ask, what are the characteristics of applicants that tend to predict successful performance on the set of tasks required to achieve professional licensure in various varieties of engineering, various sorts of engineering. It seems to me you could do that pretty straightforwardly, and you can admit people accordingly. You can say there's no point in admitting people to this program if indeed they're not going to meet this minimum requirement, whatever else they might do. So I think it seems to me the parallel with medicine is quite straightforward. If that's what you want to focus on for engineering, then I think you know what to do there.
Okay, Bronwyn's watching the hands of those who may want to speak, because Forrest is not here, apparently still out of electricity, and Monty is not with us, and Bronwyn is. So if you have a question or have a comment, raise your hand or make the electronic equivalent happen, and we'll continue. All right, Bronwyn, do you have anybody up to bat now?
Yes, just before I do that, I just want to say that the power outage is quite widespread, and that's why we don't have as many people with us this morning. Yes, I have Rodney Corker and then followed by Peter.
Rodney.
Yes, thank you, Gary and Dave. I just want to focus for a minute on the pragmatics of employability, consumer demand. Who's going to employ graduates? Who is employing our graduates? And I'd appreciate some comments on that. As a foreign student who came to America for an education, I was really interested, as in most of my foreign colleagues were, in that campus education, based education. And it was very degree, credentials focused. We came to America because they offered degrees that we couldn't get in our own country. So it was the program, the campus program, that was very important to us. So from a consumer demand, a consumer sovereignty point of view, is I could look at manpower studies and I could see where the alumni were going, what their titles were, what their salaries were, what kind of work they were doing. It gave me a high degree of predictability and utility and actually security. So I could play the probabilities of where I could spend my money and my time and get a job where there were payers there that would pay me, so I could enjoy the level of living that I aspired to. Now, two aspects on this. On the other side, the so-called Goddard experience up there is what I'm challenged with there is who will the employers be? How do you establish the worth of a graduate? Who are the who's going to pay them? How do you determine what a salary is? It sounds to me like it's about big government would be the employers and maybe a few small parochial organizations, but I don't know how value is established. And certainly employers are going to look for more than experiential fieldwork experience. And as a former health science fieldwork supervisor, I know that things can change a lot in the fieldwork, but it has to be more than experiential. It has to be more than fieldwork. Otherwise, I think you're going to find your employer pool drying up. Now, one last question here. We're getting to a question. That's a statement. That's an observation. Would be one that maybe Dr. Bull could comment on. And that was when my first graduate degree was at UCLA. Was at Loma Linda. And I was trying to find out who may employ me with my health services degree. And I went and spoke to the alumni, and the best information I could get at this, and we're talking 40 years ago, was that only around 3% of medical students, health science students, found their way or had their first employer was a Seventh-day Adventist organization. That seemed to me to be a very, very low uptake number for Loma Linda graduates finding their way into an Adventist organization. It wasn't to say they weren't doing good work and they weren't Christians in their practice and what they were doing, but it certainly did challenge me as to what kind of market are we training students for and graduating them into, and why is the sort of loss ratio seem to be so high? That's something that maybe Dr. Bull could address, because I don't know currently what is the uptake of graduates into an Adventist organization. I do know that when I worked for Adventist Health, I preferred to hire and look for students out of the Loma Linda programs for finance and managed care. I could never find anybody that was interested. And when the 2 or 3 that I did were incompetent and failed very quickly. And so I had to go to a different source group. But the issue really is the whole role of employability. It's a practical thing that we can't not talk about. Okay, so Gary, I'm interested in your perspectives on the role of employability. And yes, it might be a capitalist model that I followed. It was very successful for me, but I do worry about new programs that are more experiential based and don't pay sufficient heed to academic qualification, genuine academic qualification.
Gary, do you want to respond to that? And then
Sure.
Brian?
Yeah. I mean, I'd of course love to hear from Dr. Bull on the broader issue that Rodney raised. But I mean, my view is, yeah, absolutely. I think experiential programs do pose real difficulties insofar as it becomes very hard to know just what the competence levels of students are. If what you're getting is field work, which is itself, and maybe you've got a way to evaluate the field work, but if the way you choose to do that is the way it seems like Goddard is doing with narrative evaluations, I think you've left students out to dry. So I absolutely think that academic excellence in a program really can be quite beneficial, not just in terms of the personal growth of the student, but of the student's ability to then perform effectively outside the academic environment in ways that employers might find appealing.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bull, do you want to say something about this?
It's a little bit of a nebulous topic, and I'm not certainly Loma Linda's graduates. In fact, I think it has achieved national recognition on this score. Loma Linda's graduates find jobs more easily than from any other school or college. I don't know how they rank this, but for doctors, the question of are there enough Adventist institutions to accept our graduates, and the answer is no. And of course, many of the doctors who go into private practice would, by the measure that Rodney is suggesting, would be, quote, lost to the institutional aspect of Adventism. But it is the case that many Adventist hospitals are desperate. There may be, the hospital is called an Adventist hospital because of its financial relationships. There may only be 1 or 2 doctors on the staff that come from Loma Linda or are Adventist doctors. But all I can say is that the graduating medical class doesn't have any trouble finding positions. Whether or not those positions should be in Adventist hospitals exclusively or not, an open question. But we certainly would like more Adventist hospitals, so-called, to have more Adventist doctors on the staff.
Okay, thank you. Bronwyn, who's next?
Peter. You need to
I
unmute,
want-
Peter. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Gary, for your insights. 2 things. First, in one of his letters, Apostle Paul is talking about people that have a lot of knowledge but without understanding. In your view, the American universities, especially the liberal arts programs, are providing this knowledge with understanding, because it's very important. And in your view, if they don't, what should be done to have both? And the second thing that I want to ask is, can you draw a parallel between the first universities that were formed in Europe, approximately 12th centuries, and the universities of today?
Well, there's a lot to be said there. Thanks, Peter. I love liberal arts education, and I really enjoyed my experience as a liberal arts undergraduate. I relish the opportunity to explore a range of issues and topics and themes using different disciplinary perspectives. I don't argue at all in the book or elsewhere that only that model is desirable. And indeed, I try to clearly make that distinction in the book. I spend time talking about the U.S. model, but I don't think that that's somehow the only approach. Whether U.S. liberal arts institutions are succeeding at offering not only knowledge but understanding, I think is surely an institution by institution question. I don't think I know what to say at the global level there. I'm not even sure how I would measure that. So I feel a little helpless in trying to respond. I think that the breadth of an optimal liberal arts curriculum, it clearly is designed to foster greater understanding by ensuring breadth of context and so forth, but that may or may not be what's happening in a particular case. I mean, the worry that I think people have had for the last several decades has been that there's the risk of fragmentation of knowledge, and that there's not careful attention to the unification and integration of perspectives. And I think that's something that absolutely ought to be taken seriously. On the other hand, I've had the chance to observe what happens, as has been true at La Sierra for the past couple of decades, when an institution tries to create a model of education that does seek to integrate. Sometimes I think that works well for students, and sometimes perhaps it doesn't. Because there are different kinds of integration, maybe that are more successful, and the very strategies of integration that you employ can turn out to be controversial. The comparison between the earliest universities at places like Paris and Bologna and Oxford and Cambridge and contemporary universities is, of course, really striking, not least because, especially in the US, but even increasingly in Europe, there's the perception that a university education is not a kind of specialty preparation for certain kinds of experiences and activities in life, but rather is a kind of minimum prerequisite for active involvement in society. And so therefore everybody ends up being seen as a potential university student. That seems to be the biggest difference, and probably not a helpful one. I think there's probably a great deal to learn, for instance, from the German experience of providing a broader range of experiences and opportunities for people for the development of professional skills and networks and so forth that don't depend necessarily on the university. That the university is understood as a more specialized kind of environment, and that other kinds of professional preparation can lead to both stable, high incomes and to societal credibility. The early institutions that you note clearly focused, well, of course, especially originally on preparing people for the clergy, and kind of moved on from there to things like medicine and law, the so-called learned professions. And then also the undergraduate experiences increasingly came to serve as means of acculturation for the next generation of elites. And of course, the renewal of elites, the bringing new people into elite groups through scholarship programs and so forth. And so, yeah, we definitely are in a very different environment now in terms of what universities try to do. And I certainly don't think we should, rush back to the 12th or 13th century and find our model there. But I think we should recognize the importance of a greater variety of ways in which training can be made available, professional success can be made available, so that the university isn't expected to be all things to all people.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bronwyn.
I don't have anybody else.
Okay, we have just a few moments here. I have some very specific questions and then some much more general questions. Let's begin with the specific one. Gary, it seems to me that your prohibition of imposing pain or death on animals in experimentation might be more stringent or demanding than is often the case. I think the work that's done is usually governed by three principles. One of them is to replace the animal with something that's not an animal, if possible. The second is to reduce the number of animals one uses. And the third is to refine the invasiveness of the procedure. But there is no expectation that this will never involve wounding or maiming or even killing the animal. Would you be willing to talk about that?
So, sure, in principle. It's just that this was a kind of throwaway line in the book, and this is something I've tried to write about in more detail elsewhere. And so the book certainly doesn't provide any support for that claim. Right? It's I have no illusions that anything I've said there offers robust argumentation there. I guess I would say, simply put, that the characteristics that we tend to think make it dubious to, as an ordinary matter at any rate, cause pain to maim or kill humans turn out to be characteristics that it's easy enough to find among other kinds of living things on the planet, and that the so-called marginal cases argument highlights the fact that it becomes especially difficult to distinguish in cases where you've got humans who are not perhaps paradigmatic cases of humanists, but whom we still want to protect. So I just think if there's an argument here, and again, I think this is a big, huge topic that I'm, not at all professing to have addressed in detail in the book. It has to do with why it is we think it makes sense not to mistreat humans in this way, with the thought that it turns out to be the case that the features that prompt this where humans are concerned seem, at least in some important instances, to be present where non-humans are concerned.
Okay, thank you. Another sort of middle ground, from concrete to middle ground to one more general. The middle ground one is this. What if someone proposed that the place at which you work should be called, change the name to College of Business Evangelists? What would you say to that proposal, College of Business Evangelists?
When you say the place at which I work, you mean the Tom and Liza Parra College of Business Evangelists, or do you mean La Sierra University?
The first.
Okay. Yeah. So, my dad was, my dad enrolled at the institution that carried the name CME when it still had that name, and I think was among those who was quite delighted when the name changed, and his diploma reflected that. The College of Medical Evangelists, the College of Business Evangelists, I think these are just confusing names. They're not names that anybody else is going to understand. They're going to create the impression that folks are narrow, sectarian, and likely to try to proselytize everyone in their workplace. It just doesn't seem to me that would be remotely helpful. And it doesn't. Also, we'd have to talk in much more detail about what counts as an evangelist before I'd know whether that was an acceptable thing to say. People hear that term, and I think they often assume that what's meant is something like, actively, conveying religious ideas and trying to win religious converts. And it just doesn't seem to me that that accurately characterizes what we do or what we ought to be doing.
Okay, but my question is a way of probing, do students at your School of Business, Tom by Zapara School of Business, do they have some sense that they are called, in the sense that called to a special vocation, that is the vocation of business? I don't want to put words into McKinley's mouth, but I almost think I heard the suggestion that, well, if you're going into medicine, nursing, and so forth, that's God's work. But if you're going into engineering, that really doesn't fall under the same umbrella. How do you handle this in your School of Business?
Yeah, I mean, I can say I'm profoundly unenthusiastic about the idea that doctors and nurses are doing God's work and engineers are doing something neutral, right? I mean, it seems to me that helping to shape the effectiveness and attractiveness of the physical environment and of our technology and the way that engineers do is profoundly valuable as a contribution to human well-being. And it would strike me as thoroughly mistaken to suppose that only concern about people's bodies and not concern about their physical environments and so forth would be of spiritual significance. So, how do we address this? Probably not as well as we should, right? I mean, I think that really trying to be intentional class by class, and also intentional at the macro level in the curriculum and in terms of our co-curricular programming is, one can see in principle what that looks like. But I think it's very easy for people in almost any discipline, not just business, not just medicine, but in biochemistry or in English literature. I think you get caught up in what you do on the narrow disciplinary focus of what you do on an ongoing basis, and it becomes easy to forget about the big picture questions and the integrative issues that you'd like to raise. And it's not, I think, that we have an institution that's unconcerned about those things. It's just that I think we have to keep thinking and we have to keep pushing ourselves to be deliberate and focused there. So we have co-curricular programming that emphasizes issues about the broader context of business activity, and we hope the community impact of what business students can do with their skills. We have a curriculum that invites people to think about the integration of Seventh-day Adventist Christian faith with their business practice. But we need to do more, and I don't hesitate for a second to say, tried to think about some of that in this book about what we ought to do, with a recognition that it's not always easy.
Okay, but I think I have read some literature from your school that talks about social justice business or socially sensitive business. What's the line you use there? I don't quite have it in my mind.
So the expression, because it's the expression in the discipline, right, that we tend to employ, especially with respect to the MBA program, is social entrepreneurship.
Social entrepreneurship. Okay.
Which can mean a couple of different things, right? It can have to do with bringing entrepreneurial creativity and innovation into the nonprofit sector, and it could also have to do with bringing explicit social mission into the entrepreneurial environment.
Okay, so it's a gift both directions. I would like to end up, unless Bronwyn, do you have somebody else?
No, I don't.
Okay, I would like to end up with the section in your book in chapter 2 called Learning, with the heading Making Connections. I'm not sure how swiftly it would be possible for you to find that. It's on page 50.
Okay, sure. Hold on just a second. I'll back up to page 50. Okay. Making connections. All right.
Would you mind reading for us here in closing the first paragraph and the third paragraph?
Sure. The curriculum of an Adventist university should be premised on the conviction that God's presence and activity are universal and that all truth is God's truth. If all truth is God's truth, then all truth is valuable. But it's also the case that if all truth is God's truth, then it should be possible to understand any truth in relation to God. The kinds of superficial attempts to integrate faith and learning I have in mind in the previous paragraph may be premised on the assumption that the important thing is to put a spiritual gloss on particular subjects of study, to baptize them perhaps so that engaging with them will be safe for Christian students. And of course, it's important to recognize that Christian insights can illuminate individual subjects. But integration also means trying to see the world as a whole, seeing it in relation to God in a way not just of integrating Christian convictions into particular disciplines, but also of integrating particular disciplines with each other. An Adventist university can and should seek to be a university, an institution that encourages awareness of the deep unity of knowledge. Adventist Christian belief offers no cheap shortcuts to identifying existing links among seemingly disparate disciplines or to constructing new ones. It's never reasonable to ignore the immense diversity of reality and of human knowledge. But seeing everything in relation to God can prompt us to seek and build connections that help to unify our knowledge.
Well, I find that very, very powerful. Thank you, Gary. And we will continue this in August. But for now, here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Gary, for your sharing with Sabbath, and Dave and Bronwyn, thank you for hosting Sabbath School class again.
Great to be here.